At 19, Mara Vance owned almost nothing except an aging station wagon, a few blankets, several days of food, and $184 to her name. She'd been sleeping in the car for weeks, hiding her homelessness while temperatures in the Montana mountains dropped closer to freezing every night. Winter was coming. Work was disappearing. And Mara knew one serious breakdown could leave her without even the car she called home. Then, at a county surplus sale in Blackpine, she noticed something nobody else wanted, an abandoned railroad cabin deep beside the forgotten Crowglass Pass line. No electricity, no running water, no reliable winter road, broken windows, rotting boards, an unsafe wood stove, and miles of cold forest between it and the nearest maintained highway. The minimum price was only $50. The county property officer warned her that buying it could create more problems than it solved. Someone nearby laughed and said the rotten lumber was probably worth more than the building. But Mara wasn't looking for an investment. She was looking at 4 walls, a roof, and a door she could legally lock. So she took $50 from the last $184 she had and bought the cabin everyone else thought was worthless. Her first night nearly proved them right. The temperature plunged, wind pushed through broken glass. She didn't dare light the old stove after seeing smoke stains around the pipe, and by morning she was cold enough to understand that owning shelter and surviving inside it were 2 very different things. Still, Mara stayed. She hauled water, rationed food, gathered firewood, patched drafts, and spent what little money remained making one corner safe enough to sleep in. Then she began noticing things that didn't belong. Heavy, insulated wiring disappeared beneath the floor. A faded railroad diagram showed more signal connections than a tiny cabin should ever have controlled. An old label read, Control B, even though there was no control panel upstairs and beneath years of dirt. Mara discovered a steel fitting attached to a lever that refused to move. When she knocked on the floor beside it, the boards answered with a hollow sound. Mara carefully removed the covering and found something the county property documents had never mentioned, a concealed hatch. Under it, a narrow staircase descended beneath the cabin into darkness. At the bottom was a room that had apparently been sealed for decades. A secret railroad control room filled with dead switches, telephone equipment, routing maps, and handwritten records from a winter disaster almost everyone in Blackpine had forgotten. But one thing on the wall stopped Mara cold. The old routing map showed tracks leading 2.8 miles farther into Crowglass Pass to a place labeled Crowglass Settlement. Mara checked the modern map again. There was no settlement there, no road, no buildings, nothing but forest. And when she began searching the papers left inside the control room, the same man's name appeared again and again beside emergency messages from the catastrophic winter of 1952. Silas Bell. According to the surviving history of the railroad, Silas Bell had barely existed. According to the documents hidden beneath Mara's $50 cabin, he had been sitting in that underground room while workers and families were trapped beyond the pass, and the final log suggested he had been ordered to abandon his post before something happened that the official history never explained. What Mara eventually discovered about that forgotten room would change not only what Blackpine remembered about Crowglass Pass, but what a homeless 19-year-old girl believed survival actually meant. But before we open that final log, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are right now? I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And whether you're starting your morning, taking a break in the afternoon, or listening late at night, I hope you have a peaceful and wonderful day ahead. If you enjoy emotional mysteries, forgotten places, and survival stories like this one, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journey. Now, let's go back. To the morning Mara Vance woke inside a freezing station wagon with $184 left to her name and was about to spend 50 of it on the strangest home she had ever seen. Mara Vance woke before dawn because her feet were numb. For several seconds she stayed curled beneath 2 blankets in the back of her station wagon, listening to wind scrape dry leaves across the parking lot. Frost silvered the inside edges of the windows. Her breath appeared whenever she exhaled. She checked the cheap thermometer clip near the dashboard. 28 degrees. Great, she whispered. She pulled on yesterday's jeans beneath the blankets, added a sweatshirt over her shirt, then climbed into the driver's seat without starting the engine. Gas meant heat, but gas also meant reaching another job interview. She had learned not to confuse comfort with necessity. Her wallet held $161 in cash. Her checking account held $23, $184 between her and zero. Food was better, though not by much. Oatmeal, peanut butter, half a loaf of bread, 3 cans of soup, crackers, 2 apples, and enough instant coffee to make cold mornings slightly less miserable. Everything else she owned was packed around her clothes, her mother's old photographs, toiletries, a sleeping bag with a broken zipper, and the folder containing applications for jobs she had not gotten. Mara rubbed warmth back into her fingers and drove toward Black Pine after sunrise. She parked behind a gas station, washed her face in the restroom, brushed her hair, and changed into the cleanest shirt she had. Nobody needed to know where she had slept. By 10, she had asked about work at a grocery store, a motel, and a hardware shop. The grocery manager told her to apply online. The motel had already reduced staff after tourist season. The hardware shop might need someone before Christmas, but not yet. Leave your number, the owner said. Mara did. Though her phone service would not last forever either, she stepped outside into thin mountain sunlight and saw a notice taped inside the county building across the street. Surplus property sale, final day. She almost kept walking. Property belonged to people with mortgages, savings, and reasons to complain about taxes. Then she noticed a handwritten addition beneath the printed listings. Crow Glass Pass Rail Signal Cabin, minimum 50. Mara went inside because $50 sounded less like property and more like a mistake. Owen Pike, the county property officer, looked at her twice when she asked about it. You know what that is? A cabin, technically. He pulled a thin file from a stack. Former railroad signal structure. Railroad abandoned that section years ago. County ended up with a parcel through a chain nobody was excited about. He showed her a photograph. The building was narrow and weathered, with faded boards and a steep roof surrounded by pines. Does the land come with it? Tiny parcel around the structure. Don't imagine acreage. Road, not exactly. Mara looked up. Owen sighed. There's old access from a forest route, but winter maintenance stops well before the property. You'd walk the last stretch depending on conditions. Electricity? No. Water? No. Septic? Owen stared at her. No. An older man waiting nearby laughed. Lady, $50 is too much. You might get that much firewood after it falls down. Mara ignored him. Can someone live there? Owen leaned back. Oh, and habitability are different questions. I'm selling surplus property as is, not certifying it as a residence. Roof may leak. Structure hasn't been inspected for occupancy. There could be rot, animals, unsafe wiring, stove problems. You understand? She understood more than he knew. $50 could buy several nights somewhere cheap, if she found somewhere cheap. It could buy food, gas, part of a phone bill. Spending it on a collapsing railroad shed could be the stupidest decision she had made since losing her room. But motel money disappeared after the last night. Food disappeared after the last meal. $50 for a building meant there might still be a building tomorrow. Can I lock the door? She asked. Owen paused. There's a door. That wasn't my question. He checked the file. Existing lock is probably useless, but if the frame is sound, you could install one. 4 walls, a roof, a door nobody could legally tell her to move her car away from at 2 in the morning. Mara looked at the photograph again. I'll take it. The older man laughed harder. Owen did not. You should see it first. If I leave and somebody else pays $51, nobody has bid on it. That's not what I asked. 20 minutes later, after signatures and warnings, Mara was $50 poorer. She counted the remaining cash twice before putting it away. $134 left in total. Owen gave her directions and an old property key that looked too clean to belong to the cabin. Weather changes fast up there, he said. Don't let owning it convince you it's safe. By early afternoon, Mara was driving out of Black Pine with everything she owned still packed behind her. Pavement became a narrow mountain road, then gravel. The forest thickened as she climbed. Patches of old snow survived in shaded ditches. Her station wagon slipped once on frozen mud, and she stopped before the road became worse. According to Owen's directions, the cabin was less than a mile ahead along the abandoned railroad grade. Mara packed a flashlight, water bottle, gloves, crackers, and 1 blanket into a backpack. She left a note on the dashboard with her destination, though she wasn't sure who she imagined would read it. The walk took longer than expected. Fallen branches crossed the grade, and weeds grew between remnants of old ballast. The mountains blocked the afternoon sun early. Then the trees opened, and Mara saw her $50 home. The photograph had been generous. 1 window was cracked, another had been covered with plywood. Paint had peeled almost entirely from the siding. The porch consisted of 2 questionable steps. She tried the key. The door stuck before opening with a groan. The smell inside was dust, damp wood, and animal droppings. Mara stood still until her eyes adjusted. The cabin had 1 main room and a smaller rear section. Broken glass glittered beneath a window. 1 corner of the floor showed dark rot. An old iron wood stove stood near the wall, its pipe disappearing through the roof. She did not touch it. She tested boards carefully with her boot and found a dry section along the opposite wall. Dry enough for bedding. Safe enough, perhaps, for 1 night. $50, she murmured. Something yellowed hung above a narrow workbench. Mara wiped dust away and found an old railroad diagram beneath cracked glass. Lines branched across it toward numbered signals and junction marks. She knew almost nothing about railroads, but even she could see something strange. The tiny cabin appeared connected to far more routes and signals than the single abandoned track outside suggested. Mara leaned closer, trying to understand the faded labels, until cold air touched her face. The light beyond the cracked window had turned blue-gray. She stepped outside and looked toward the way she had come. A thin glaze of ice was already forming over shaded sections of the old grade, and somewhere beyond the trees, the mountain road was freezing with it. Mara looked back at the broken window, the rotten floor, the untested stove, and the darkening cabin she had just bought with more than a quarter of everything she had left. For the first time that day, her station wagon seemed luxurious. But it was nearly a mile away. Darkness was coming fast, and the safest road back down the mountain was already turning to ice. By the time Mara accepted that she was not walking back to the station wagon, the last useful daylight had almost disappeared. The cabin was bad shelter, but darkness on an icy mountain grade was worse. She closed the door and inspected the dry corner again with her flashlight. The floor there felt solid under her boots. She swept animal droppings away with a broken piece of board, then used the plywood-covered window and her backpack to block the strongest drafts. The cracked window was harder. Cold air slipped through the broken edge continuously. So Mara stuffed an old shirt against the gap and held it there with pieces of loose wood. It looked ridiculous. The wind weakened. That was enough. She considered the iron stove. One fire could change everything. She could already imagine heat spreading through the room, drying her gloves and warming the floor. Then she remembered Owen Pike's warning, unsafe stove problems. Mara raised her flashlight toward the pipe, but could not see enough to trust it. A bad chimney could fill the cabin with smoke or carbon monoxide while she slept. She left the stove cold. "Congratulations," she muttered. "You bought a refrigerator." She put on every useful layer she had carried, wrapped the blanket around herself, and sat against the wall rather than lying directly on the floor. Hunger tempted her to eat more than she should. Instead, she counted the crackers and ate 6 slowly with water. Her station wagon held the rest of her supplies less than a mile away, but that distance might as well have been 20 miles in darkness and ice. The temperature continued falling. Mara tucked her hands beneath her arms and tried not to think about the fact that she had voluntarily exchanged the relative safety of her car for this. In the station wagon, she had been homeless, but she understood the rules. Park where nobody complained, save gasoline, keep belongings hidden, leave early, here. The rules belonged to weather, wood, water, and mistakes. Nobody would knock on the window and tell her to move. Nobody might notice if she needed help either. Sleep came in short pieces. Every unfamiliar sound woke her. Branches scratching the roof, something small moving inside the rear wall, wind pushing against the cracked glass. Before dawn, Mara began shivering hard enough that her teeth clicked. She stood and walked slowly around the safe section of floor to generate warmth, careful not to sweat. When gray light finally appeared, she felt as though she had survived several nights instead of one. Her first thought was coffee. Her second was water. The bottle in her backpack was less than half full. Mara remembered an old creek marked near the access route on the property map Owen had given her. She ate 2 crackers, packed the bottle, flashlight, gloves, and map, then stepped outside. A thin layer of snow covered the abandoned railroad grade. The air smelled clean enough to hurt. She followed the map downhill until she heard moving water beneath the trees. The creek was narrow, cold, and clear. But Mara knew clear did not mean safe. She filled a bottle and returned to the cabin before treating the water with the purification tablets she kept among her emergency supplies. Waiting for them to work made thirst feel worse while she sat on the porch step. A voice behind her said, "You camping?" Mara turned so quickly she nearly dropped the bottle. A man stood 20 feet away on the old grade wearing a forestry jacket and carrying a small pack. He looked only a few years older than she was. No, his eyes moved from her to the cabin. "Then I'm guessing you're the person who bought this place." Mara stood. "How would you know? Black Pine is small, and a 19-year-old buying the old signal cabin for $50 is better gossip than anything we've had this week." She disliked that immediately. "Glad I could entertain everyone. Eli Mercer?" He did not offer his hand when she failed to move closer. "Seasonal forestry work. Volunteer search and rescue, too. I'm checking access conditions before the weather gets worse. Mara?" "I know. Apparently everybody does." Eli glanced at the untreated-looking bottle beside her. "Crete treated. Good." His gaze moved to the chimney. "You used the stove last night?" "No." "Better answer than I expected." Mara folded her arms. "I survived before you got here. I didn't say you didn't." He walked no closer than the porch. "But that stove hasn't been maintained in years. Chimney could be blocked, cracked, anything. Don't light it until somebody checks it." "I already figured that out." "Good." His calm agreement annoyed her more than an argument would have. Eli looked toward the sky. Forecast moved up. Snow this afternoon. How much? Enough that I wouldn't count on driving out tonight. Mara glanced toward the grade. My car's down by the forest road. That's better than having it up here. He pointed toward the cabin. You have food? Yes. Dry bedding? Yes. Enough water? Working on it. He nodded instead of interrogating her further. Before leaving, he said, Cold makes people hurry. That's when they do stupid things. Don't let needing heat convince you that stove is safe. Mara watched him disappear between the trees. She hated being advised by strangers, especially when they were right. After retrieving more supplies from her car while the grade was still manageable, she spent the late morning inspecting the cabin. Near the wall beneath the old railroad diagram, she found thick insulated wiring descending from an obsolete metal box and disappearing through the floor. When Eli passed again on his return route, she pointed it out. He crouched without touching it. That's heavy for a little signal hut, meaning, I don't know. He stood. Old railroad equipment can be weird. Don't start pulling things apart because they look dead. Another warning. Free of charge. The first flakes began falling before he reached the trees. Mara carried her supplies inside and watched snow gather against the cracked window. She had food, treated water, blankets, and 4 walls. What she did not have was reliable heat. She turned toward the iron stove again. In daylight, she could finally inspect the pipe more carefully. Dark stains spread across the wall near where it entered the chimney, and a blackened streak climbed toward the ceiling. Mara raised the flashlight and felt her stomach drop. Someone had used this stove before, and judging by the smoke stains surrounding the pipe, something had gone wrong. By midday, the snow had covered the old railroad grade deeply enough that Mara stopped thinking about reaching Black Pine before morning. She concentrated on the cabin instead. Heat came first. The black stains around the stovepipe were too serious to ignore, and Eli's warning had removed any temptation to gamble. Mara walked down to her station wagon while visibility was still good and found enough cell service near the forest road to make several calls. The first 2 people she reached refused to come anywhere near Crowglass Pass with snow moving in. The third chimney and stove technician outside Black Pine agreed to inspect it the following afternoon if the access road remained passable. Mara nearly refused when he named the minimum charge. Instead, she looked toward the White Mountains and reminded herself that being broke did not make carbon monoxide less dangerous. Okay, she said. Come if you safely can. The inspection cost enough to hurt. The stove itself was old but usable. The pipe connection needed attention. Accumulated debris had restricted the flue, and a damaged section had contributed to the smoke staining. The technician cleaned what he could, replaced the unsafe connector, and showed Mara exactly what to watch for. Don't improvise with fire, he told her. People get creative when they're cold. I'm learning everybody in Montana gives the same lecture. Means you should probably listen. When he left, Mara stood beside the first controlled fire she had safely lit inside the cabin. Heat slowly spread into the room. She held her hands near the stove and felt an almost embarrassing wave of relief. It was the first time since buying the place that the cabin seemed capable of keeping her alive rather than merely delaying the cold. The feeling lasted until she counted her money. Between the purchase of fuel, basic supplies, and stove work, her remaining cash had fallen frighteningly fast. 4 walls were becoming expensive. Mara established rules. Firewood stayed dry and stacked away from the stove. Water came from the creek and was treated every time. Food stayed sealed against animals. Wet clothing never went into her bedding. She patched drafts with inexpensive materials from town, but she did not attempt repairs she did not understand. Eli stopped by 2 days later and examined the changes without offering praise she had not asked for. Better, he said. That's all you want, a certificate? Maybe something with a gold star? He pointed at her firewood. Some of that's too green. It burns badly. Mara looked at the stack. So what am I supposed to do? Eli showed her how to separate the driest pieces and keep newly gathered wood where it could season rather than depending on whatever she found the same day. He also pointed out dead standing wood she could legally gather under local rules and warned her against cutting anything she had no right to take. Mara listened because she had already learned that stubbornness did not produce heat. You know, Eli said, asking before doing something dangerous is allowed. I asked about the stove after sleeping beside it without using it, which was the correct decision. It was. She narrowed her eyes. You're very irritating when you agree with me, I've been told. Her financial problem remained. Black Pine had little seasonal work, but Mara found temporary hours cleaning rooms at a small motel and stocking shelves in the evenings when someone called out. The work was inconsistent and paid poorly, yet it turned the cabin from an impossible expense into a difficult one. On working days, she drove as far as conditions allowed and walked the remaining distance, carrying supplies in her backpack. Every purchase became a calculation. Peanut butter or canned meat, better gloves or more fuel, weather stripping or an extra bag of groceries. She stopped thinking of the $50 price as the cost of the cabin. $50 had merely allowed the problems to become hers. Still, improvements accumulated. She covered the worst window gaps properly instead of stuffing clothing into them. She cleared debris without disturbing questionable sections of floor. She designated one corner for food, one for bedding, and another for tools. The cabin remained ugly, but it began to function. One evening, while sealing a draft along the wall beneath the faded railroad diagram, Mara noticed a sequence of numbers stamped into a narrow metal strip near the baseboard. She wiped away grime. The markings looked intentional equipment references. Perhaps, though she could not interpret them. Several corresponded to numbers on the diagram above. She followed them toward the rear of the room. The thick, insulated wiring Eli had noticed vanished through the floor beside an old metal housing. Mara removed loose dirt around it with a brush rather than pulling anything. Beneath decades of dust, she uncovered a steel fitting. Attached to it was a short lever lying almost flush with the floor. She tried gentle pressure. Nothing. She stopped rather than forcing it. What were you for? She whispered. The railroad diagram offered another clue. With the glass cleaned, more faded lettering became visible. Signal numbers branched toward junction marks. Near one edge was a label she had previously assumed was damaged. Mara brought her flashlight closer. Control B. She searched the rest of the diagram. There was no obvious Control A. More importantly, there was no second control area anywhere in the cabin. She checked the rear section, the walls, the old workbench, even the exterior while daylight remained. Nothing explained the label. When Eli passed the next morning, Mara showed him the steel fitting. Don't yank it, he said immediately. I didn't? Good. Do you know what it is? He crouched and studied it. No. You work in forests and rescue people. You're becoming less useful by the day. I'll try to recover emotionally. He traced the direction of the heavy cable without touching it. Whatever this equipment did, there was more going on here than one switch beside one track. Mara pointed toward Control B. Eli studied the diagram. Could refer to equipment that was removed. That's what I thought. Or something elsewhere. Elsewhere where I said I don't know, after he left. Mara returned to practical work. A cold front was expected. And Mysteries did not collect firewood. She hauled 2 manageable loads rather than exhausting herself with one enormous trip. She treated water, checked the stove, and ate soup with bread while reviewing her dwindling money. Only after the cabin was ready for night did she return to the floor. The section surrounding the steel lever bothered her for a reason she could finally identify. Most boards ran continuously from the wall toward the center of the room. Here, several ended along a straight line. Their color was slightly different. The nail pattern changed too. It looked less like ordinary repair and more like something had once been opened and deliberately covered again. Mara knelt and pressed her palm against the boards. Solid. She moved 6 inches and knocked with her knuckles. A dull wooden thud answered. She knocked farther away, another dull thud. Then she tapped directly beside the frozen steel lever. The sound changed. Mara tapped again. Hollow. She sat back on her heels, looking from the mismatched floorboards to the heavy wiring disappearing beneath them, then up at the faded words Control B, whatever the old railroad cabin had once controlled. Part of it appeared to be underneath her. Mara waited until morning before touching the mismatched floor again. Curiosity had kept her awake, but the cabin had already taught her that impatience was expensive. She built the fire first, treated water, ate oatmeal, checked the weather, and made sure she had enough daylight for whatever came next. Only then did she clear the area around the steel lever. The boards were old, but not rotten. That mattered. A rotten patch could have meant nothing more than repair work. These boards had been cut deliberately, their ends aligned around a rectangle almost 3 feet long. Mara brushed dirt from the seams and found 2 recessed metal rings, one so clogged with grime that she had mistaken it for a nail head. She tried lifting one. Nothing moved. The wood had swollen with age, and whatever lay beneath had sealed itself shut. She resisted the urge to pry hard if the opening concealed a drop, damaged stairs, trapped animals, or weakened supports. Breaking through without knowing what was below would be stupid. Instead, she spent nearly an hour working around the edges with a narrow scraper, loosening packed dirt and old paint. When Eli arrived along the grade shortly before noon, he found her kneeling beside the rectangle. "You discovered a trapdoor and decided this was a normal Tuesday?" he asked. "I discovered something shaped like one." He crouched beside her. "You opened it?" "Not yet." "Good. You sound disappointed." "I'm trying not to encourage you." Together, they examined the seams without forcing anything. Eli tapped the surrounding floor and agreed the hollow space was real. "Could be a crawl space," he said, "or utility access with a lever. Old railroads put strange things in stranger places." Mara pointed to the recessed strings. "Help me lift it." Eli looked at the ceiling, then the walls, then the floor. "Not until we know it isn't supporting something important." That irritated her because it was reasonable. They checked the cabin foundation from outside where snow had thinned against the walls. The hidden section appeared to sit above a stone and concrete base deeper than the rest of the cabin. No obvious collapse, no fresh cracks. Eli still insisted on caution. "If it opens, you don't climb into a hole just because there's a ladder." "I know. I'm serious." "So am I." He studied her for a second, then nodded. By afternoon, Mara had freed the edges enough to move the panel a fraction. It was heavier than expected. The steel lever beside it did not release the hatch directly, but after she cleared more grime, she found an old latch mechanism connected to the same frame. The lever remained frozen, probably rusted internally, yet the latch itself could be worked by hand. Mara pulled, the panel rose 1/2 inch and stopped. Cold, stale air seeped through the gap. She froze, not because of fear exactly, because the smell was different from the cabin dry dust. Old metal, stone. A closed place, Ali wedged the block beneath the opening while Mara loosened the far edge. They lifted again. This time the hedge rose enough to expose darkness below. Mara shone her flashlight through. A narrow wooden staircase disappeared downward at a steep angle. "Well," Eli said quietly, "not a crawl space." Mara's pulse quickened. She crouched at the edge without stepping down. The beam illuminated rough walls, metal conduit, and perhaps 8 visible steps before fading. How deep? Can't tell. I'm going down. Not yet. She looked at him. I bought the place, and gravity doesn't care. He pointed into the opening. Old enclosed space. We don't know if the stairs are sound, if there's bad air, if part of the ceiling failed, if something lives down there. Mara hated how much she wanted to ignore all of that. The discovery felt like the first thing the cabin had given her instead of demanded from her. But she thought about the stove, the smoke stains, the money she had spent because one shortcut could have been fatal. Fine, she said. They left the hatch propped open while Mara ate and while fresh air moved through the opening. Eli had a more powerful flashlight and a length of rope in his pack, and Mara used a long piece of scrap wood to test the first several steps from above. Solid enough. She descended only after they had checked what they reasonably could, with Eli remaining at the hatch. If I say come back up, come back up. You're enjoying this authority. Not even slightly. The staircase was narrower than it looked. Mara placed each boot carefully, testing before shifting her weight. The temperature dropped as she descended, but the air remained dry. At the bottom, her flashlight opened into a room far larger than she expected. She stopped on the final step. What Eli called from above, Mara did not answer immediately. The room extended beneath most of the cabin and possibly beyond it. One wall held rows of dead mechanical equipment, metal housings, switches, old indicator lamps, heavy cables, and several large handles mounted beneath faded labels. Across from them stood a long desk coated in dust. A black telephone handset rested beside a metal box. Maps covered another wall beneath yellowed protective sheets. Shelves held binders, logbooks, paper tags, and rusted tools. Nothing glowed. Nothing moved. It was all obsolete, silent, and clearly built for more than one signal beside one forgotten track. There's a whole room, Mara said. Eli descended only after she moved away from the stairs. His expression changed when he reached the bottom. That's not normal. You finally know something? I know this is a lot of equipment for the shack upstairs. Mara approached the nearest control board without touching it. Several labels matched the faded diagram in the cabin signal numbers. Junction codes. Control B. A second panel farther along bore the almost erased marking Control A. There, she said. That's the missing one. The steel lever upstairs had not been a meaningless relic. It had belonged to a larger system hidden beneath her feet. Mara moved toward the wall maps. Most showed the abandoned railroad line crossing Crowglass Pass, with sidings, maintenance points, drainage structures, and numbered signal locations. But one map was more detailed. It showed buildings, not one or two sheds, a cluster, rectangles aligned beside the track, labeled with small handwritten notes, bunkhouse, stores, maintenance, pump house. Mara leaned closer. Eli. He came beside her. A bold line ran from the signal cabin northward along the track, then split near the cluster. Beside it, printed in block letters, were words neither of them expected. Crowglass Settlement, 2.8 miles north. Mara stared. Settlement? Eli frowned. I've never heard of one. Maybe it was just railroad buildings. Could be. Wouldn't it be on a map? Not necessarily an old modern map. Depends what it was. Mara climbed back upstairs and retrieved the county property map from her backpack. She spread it beside the old railroad sheet. The modern map showed the abandoned great forest parcels, drainage lines, and county boundaries. North of the cabin, there was nothing marked for miles. No town, no settlement, no structures. She returned below with the map and aligned the creek bends and rail grade as closely as she could. The locations matched. The old map was not pointing somewhere else. 2.8 miles, Mara said. Right into that forest. Eli studied both maps. If anything was there, it is gone now. Mara looked around the underground room again, at the dead switches, the telephone, the shelves of forgotten records. The cabin above had looked like a worthless relic nobody wanted for $50. Beneath it was an entire control room built to serve a rail line and a settlement that modern maps did not acknowledge. Mara put one finger on the faded label, Crowglass Settlement 2.8 miles north. How does a whole place disappear? Mara spent the next morning in Blackpine because curiosity was easier to manage when she was warm, fed, and somewhere with cell service. She had already learned that mounting questions could wait, water, fuel, and paid work could not. She stopped shells for 4 hours at the grocery store, bought only what she needed afterward, then carried her notebook and photographs of the underground map to the public library. The modern county maps showed Crowglass Pass as forest land crossed by an abandoned rail grade. Older maps showed the rail line more clearly, but still no proper town named Crowglass. Mara began to wonder whether settlement had meant something smaller than she imagined. By late afternoon she had found references to maintenance structures, siding numbers, snow sheds, and a work camp that appeared briefly in railroad documents before disappearing from later records. Nothing explained the cluster of buildings on the control room map. The librarian suggested she speak with Ruth Calder, a retired railroad maintenance clerk who still lived near the east edge of Blackpine. If it involved that old line, Ruth either knows it or knows who forgot it, she said. Ruth answered her door wearing a thick cardigan and an expression that suggested Mara had interrupted something more important. What railroad? She asked. Crowglass Pass. Ruth's expression changed slightly. What about it, Mara? Showed her the photograph of the map. Ruth took the phone, enlarged the image, then looked at Mara again. Where did you get this? In the old signal cabin, up by the abandoned grade. I bought it. Why? It cost $50. Ruth stared at her for a moment. That still doesn't answer why. It had a roof. Something in Mara's tone must have ended the question, because Ruth looked back at the photograph. Crowglass wasn't a town, she said, not the way Blackpine is. Then what was it? Railroad settlement? Maintenance families, bunkhouses, storage, signal people, men who kept track open through winter, and families who lived too close to the work because getting anywhere else took time. Mara opened her notebook. How many people changed constantly? Small, sometimes a few families, sometimes more workers during heavy maintenance, never enough for anybody important to care about putting it on tourist maps. What happened to it? Ruth gave the phone back. The branch stopped mattering. Buildings were dismantled, moved, burned, collapsed. Whatever came first, forest did the rest. And the control room? What control room? Mara showed her another photograph with the underground equipment, the rows of switches, the desk and wall maps. Ruth leaned closer. That was under the cabin. Still is. The irritation disappeared from Ruth's face. My father worked Crowglass at the settlement maintenance crew, mostly track work. I was a child when he left the railroad. She studied the image again. He mentioned emergency routing during bad winters. I thought he meant the signal office upstairs. There's more equipment downstairs than upstairs. Clearly, Ruth tapped one corner of the photograph, those relay boards are old manual control, nothing fancy. But that room would have been useful when normal operations failed. Failed how? Ruth was quiet for several seconds. There was one winter everybody talked about when I was young, 1952. Heavy snow, slides, damaged communications. My father hated talking about it. Was Crowglass cut off? Parts of the line were people trapped, probably. I don't remember enough to promise you details. Ruth looked at Mara firmly. Don't turn fragments into facts because they make a better story. Mara nodded. I won't. The following day, with clear weather and a stable forecast, Mara decided to see how much of the old settlement remained. She packed treated water, food,
extra socks, flashlight, map, basic first aid supplies.
And more layers than she thought she would need. Eli crossed paths with her near the cabin as she was checking the old grade northward. "Where are you going, 2.8 miles? That answer makes me nervous." Mara showed him the old map. "Crowglass settlement?" Eli studied the weather, then her pack. "Turn around before the weather turns, not after." "I know, and distance on an old rail map isn't the same as an easy walk." "I know." He looked at her. "You're saying that more lately. Maybe you repeat yourself more lately." The first mile was easier than expected. The abandoned gray gave her a clear line through the pines, though fallen branches and washouts slowed her. Old drainage ditches ran beside the track bed. Rusted metal fragments appeared occasionally between stones. Farther north, the forest thickened and the grade narrowed where erosion had eaten into one side. Clouds began gathering over the ridge sooner than Mara expected. She checked the time. She was not yet at the full distance marked on the map. A month earlier, she might have kept going simply because turning back would feel like failure. Instead, she stopped. The wind had shifted colder. Visibility toward the higher slope was worsening. She marked her approximate location and began returning. On the way back, she noticed something she had missed going north, a squared line of stones half buried beneath pine needles just off the grade. She brushed away enough debris to reveal a corner foundation. Nearby, rusted boards protruded from a decaying timber. 50 feet farther, a shallow, rectangular depression sat where the trees grew younger than the surrounding forest. It was not a town. It was evidence that something had once stood there. Mara took photographs and continued back before the weather could make the decision for her. Ruth looked at the images later that evening and nodded. Maintenance structures, most likely. Maybe outer edge of the settlement.
So the map was real. I never said it wasn't. You look like you wanted to. I wanted you not to assume a vanished city was hiding in the woods. Mara smiled. Fair. Ruth had brought an old railroad history book from her house, along with photocopied notes her father had kept.
Together, they compared names from the underground documents with employee lists. Several surnames matched. Others did not. One appeared repeatedly in Mara's photographs of handwritten tags and equipment labels. Silas Bell. "Do you know him?" Mara asked. Ruth shook her head. "Name sounds familiar, but I can't place it." They checked the book's section on the winter of 1952. It mentioned block track, extraordinary snowfall, emergency maintenance, and management decisions that restored operations after repeated disruptions. A few supervisors were named. Several crew leaders were credited. Silas Bell was not among them. Mara flipped through the employee index. Nothing. "Maybe he wasn't important," she said. Ruth frowned. "Maybe, but his name is all over the room. That's what bothers me." Mara returned to the cabin before dark and descended into the control room with a flashlight and notebook. She began checking shelves more carefully, looking only for Silas Bell. His name appeared on equipment inspection slips, handwritten routing notes, and one worn binder tab. Behind the binder, partly hidden by a fallen stack of papers, lay a thin black ledger swollen with age. Mara lifted it gently and brushed dust from the cover. Written across the front in faded pencil were 4 words. S. Bell Emergency Operations. She opened to the first page. At the top, in cramped handwriting, Silas had written a date, from the winter of 1952. Below it was a time, a weather report, and the first line of what looked like a continuous emergency log. Mara carried Silas Bell's black ledger upstairs because the control room was too cold to sit in for long. She placed it on the workbench beside the stove, washed the dust from her hands, and made herself eat before reading. Dinner was half a can of soup stretched with water and 2 pieces of bread. Her food supply had begun shrinking faster than she liked, and the small stack of cash in her wallet was doing the same. The cabin was warmer now, but warmth required wood, repairs, gasoline, and time. Mara opened the ledger only after checking the stove and setting aside enough dry fuel for the night. Silas's first entries were almost disappointingly ordinary. Times, temperatures, snow depth, signal conditions, track reports. 6:40 snow increasing, west wind. Section crew reports drift beyond mile 41 north wire intermittent. Mara turned the page. The handwriting became tighter as conditions worsened. A slide had blocked part of the line. Another crew reported damaged equipment farther into Crowglass Pass. Telephone communication failed in sections, returned briefly, then failed again. Silas recorded every interruption. He did not describe fear. He wrote what still worked. One line listed 3 workers dispatched to inspect track. Another recorded food requested for families at the settlement. A later entry noted that a maintenance crew had failed to report at the expected time. Mara found herself leaning closer. The disaster had not arrived as one dramatic event. It accumulated. Snow became deeper. One blocked section became 2. A damaged line made communication unreliable. Men sent to fix one problem became people who needed to be accounted for themselves. The control room beneath Mara's cabin had become a place where fragments of information met. Silas received a report from one direction, wrote it down, then relayed it when another connection became available. The old switches downstairs suddenly made more sense. He had not been commanding the mountain. He had been trying to keep people talking across it. Mara took photographs of several pages and brought them to Ruth the next afternoon, after finishing a short motel cleaning shift. Ruth read slowly at her kitchen table. "That sounds like what my father used to describe," she said. "Everything failing one piece at a time. Silas keeps requesting people." Mara pointed to the page. "Here. 2 men to check the north line. Someone to carry a message when the telephone goes out. More fuel for the settlement." Ruth nodded. Railroad work was never one man sitting at a machine. The history book makes it sound like management fixed everything. History books like names with titles. Ruth turned another page. "Storms prefer crews." Mara smiled, then looked at the next entry. A supply movement had been delayed because the track could not be confirmed clear. Silas refused to route it until he received information from a maintenance crew farther north. He waited. That was his job. People were asking for supplies, and sending something blindly into blocked track could create another emergency. Mara understood that better than she would have weeks earlier. Survival was often less dramatic than action. Sometimes the correct choice was waiting. Back at the cabin that evening, the lesson became less comfortable. Mara counted her supplies. Her dry firewood pile was lower than she expected. Food would last several days if she rationed carefully, but her next reliable work shift was uncertain. She could drive into Black Pine and spend money on groceries and prepared firewood, or conserve cash and depend more heavily on what she could gather and the food already on hand. Neither option felt good. She chose essentials, food first, enough fuel margin that one wet day would not leave her desperate. No unnecessary purchases. In town the next morning, she stood for almost 5 minutes holding a package of better thermal socks before returning it to the shelf. Her current socks were uncomfortable, not dangerous. Food and fuel won. Eli found her stacking wood beside the cabin later that day. "That pile finally looks dry," he said. "I've achieved your approval. I can retire." "Don't. Retirement benefits are terrible." Mara showed him one photograph from Silas's ledger. "Look at how many times he asked for help." Eli read it. "Smart man. I thought you'd say that." "You sound disappointed." "I'm noticing a theme." Eli handed the phone back. "People misunderstand being prepared. They think it means never needing anybody." Usually it means knowing what you can handle and what you need before you're desperate. Mara lifted another piece of wood. I'm handling it. I didn't say you weren't. She carried the wood inside harder than necessary. That night she returned to Silas. The entries had reached the worst portion of the storm. Snow measurements became irregular because conditions outside were too dangerous for routine checks. A crew reported an avalanche across the grade. Another message mentioned families being moved into fewer heated buildings to conserve fuel. Communication with the upper section failed for nearly 3 hours. When it returned, Silas wrote only "Contact restored, 4 accounted for, 2 locations still unanswered." Mara read that sentence twice. Somewhere beyond the cabin, in the same forest now surrounding her. People had once waited without knowing who was safe. Silas kept writing. Requests, responses, names, track conditions. One message passed through 3 different points because no direct line remained functional. He used whatever connection still existed. Mara glanced around her cabin. She had spent months doing the opposite. After losing her room, she had stopped telling people how bad things were. Uncle Ben had offered her a temporary place, and she had refused, because arriving at his door with everything she owned felt worse than sleeping in her car. She had told herself that if she needed nobody, nobody could decide when she had stayed too long. The thought made her close the ledger. She added wood to the stove and checked the latch on the door. Outside, the temperature was dropping again. Asking for help had never felt like survival to her. It felt like handing somebody else control. Silas's log treated it as procedure. Need 2 men, need fuel, need confirmation, need another line. No shame, just the next requirement. Mara reopened the ledger. Several pages later, the storm reached a critical point. A note from farther down the line warned that normal telephone service could no longer be maintained. Silas began documenting alternative relays through maintenance points. Then came a page where the handwriting changed sharply. The letters pressed harder into the paper. Primary line lost. Beneath it, North Circuit unreliable. Settlement contact intermittent. Another entry followed 23 minutes later. Instruction received, suspend control operations and evacuate post when passage permits. Mara sat still. Silas had been ordered to leave. She turned the page, expecting the record to end. Instead, the next lines showed him still transmitting. Weather, names, missing crews, a supply request. Then, near the bottom, normal line failed completely. Below that, in darker pencil, ordered to abandon control room. It was the final entry on the page. Mara turned it carefully. The next sheet began with a date. She checked it against a previous one. The following morning. Silas's handwriting continued beneath it. Whatever order he had received, he had not abandoned the control room. Mara read the next morning's entries 3 times before she understood what Silas Bell had done. He had not stayed because the control room itself mattered. He had stayed because people farther up Crowglass Pass were still missing. The first entry after dawn listed 4 names, followed by a note. No confirmation. Beneath that, Silas recorded a broken relay from a maintenance point north of the settlement. The message had come through badly, then vanished. Another line showed him requesting someone at the lower section to keep listening for any return signal. 20 minutes later, a second name was marked safe. 2 others remained unaccounted for. Mara traced the handwriting with her eyes. There was nothing heroic in the wording. No speech, no declaration that he would sacrifice himself. He simply kept working. 7:42 upper, siding reports movement near snowshed. 8:10, unable to verify. 8:37, request repeated. 9:05, contact through maintenance relay. The room had become the point where scattered pieces of information met. One worker carried a message to another structure. Someone repaired part of a line long enough for a report to pass. A crew farther down confirmed track conditions. Silas wrote it all down. shifted information from one surviving connection to another, then waited for replies. Mara realized the story was larger than him precisely because he never wrote as if it belonged to him. She brought the ledger to Ruth that afternoon. Ruth had already spread her father's old papers across the kitchen table. "I found something," she said before Mara sat down. With Ruth lifted a brittle sheet protected inside a clear sleeve. "My father's crew designation." Mara leaned closer. Ruth pointed to a handwritten notation beside a maintenance section number. "That was his group." The same designation appeared in Silas's log. Mara opened the ledger and found the page. Ruth's face tightened. The entry was brief. North Maintenance Group, isolated beyond obstruction. 3 men, condition unknown. Several hours later, another line recorded a fragmentary report that they had shelter but little fuel. Ruth sat very still. "He never told us this part. Maybe he didn't want to. He talked about snow. He talked about men walking track with shovels but not being cut off." Her finger remained beside the entry. "My mother would have been waiting in Crowglass then." Mara looked up. "At the settlement for part of that winter, yes." Ruth swallowed and turned another page. "There." Silas had recorded a request for fuel and food to be moved when the route became safe enough. This wasn't him saving them by himself. Mara said, "No." Ruth's voice was quiet. "Someone had to clear track. Someone had to move supplies. Someone had to receive the message." But he kept the message moving. Mara thought of Eli's words about preparation and needing people before desperation. Silas's strength had not been isolation. His usefulness depended on everyone else doing their part. Later that day, Mara returned to the cabin with the realization still bothering her. A colder system was moving toward Black Pine, and she decided to increase her firewood reserve before it arrived. She had enough for ordinary use, but enough had begun to feel fragile. She made one trip, then another. By the third, her shoulders ached. She told herself she could manage one more load. The wood was dry, the path familiar, the distance short. She stacked too much into her arms anyway. Halfway back, one piece slipped. She caught it awkwardly, twisting her shoulder. Pain shot down her arm. She stopped, breathing hard. The cold had sharpened while she worked, and sweat had dampened the back of her shirt beneath her layers. She knew that was bad. She also knew the cabin was close. Mara picked the wood up again, put half of it down. Eli's voice came from behind her. She turned. He was walking up the grade with his pack, expression already annoyed. "I've got it." "That wasn't a question. I said I've got it." "You're sweating in freezing weather and favoring your right shoulder." "I'm carrying wood." People get tired. People also get hypothermic because they decide finishing a chore matters more than staying dry. Mara tightened her grip. "I don't need help carrying firewood." This isn't about firewood. Something in his tone made her angrier than the words. "Then what is it about?" Eli stepped closer, but did not take the load from her. "You keep treating every warning like somebody is trying to take something from you. Because people usually want something when they help. I don't, maybe not now. Mara, I've lived long enough without anybody fixing things for me. You're 19. Exactly. And I learned early." Eli looked at her for a moment. "What did you learn?" She almost walked away. Instead, the answer came before she could stop it. That depending on people is how you end up with nowhere to go. The forest went quiet around them. Mara immediately wished she had said less. Eli's expression changed, but not into pity. "The mountain doesn't care what lesson you learned somewhere else," he said. "It punishes the same mistakes anyway. So now I'm making mistakes right now." "Yes," he pointed at her damp collar. "You're cold, tired, overloaded, and too stubborn to drop wood because dropping it feels like losing. Mara stared at him. You don't know what losing feels like for me. No, I don't, his answer was immediate. But I know search and rescue. Pride doesn't keep people warm. She looked down at the load. Her arms were trembling. Not badly, but enough. Without speaking, she set half the wood beside the grate. Eli did not smile. He did not say I told you so. He carried only what she handed him, and together they returned to the cabin. That restraint bothered her almost as much as the argument inside. Mara changed the damp layer, drank something warm, and rested her shoulder. Eli checked that she could move it without serious pain, then left once she was warm and steady. Before going, he said, needing someone for one thing doesn't mean they own the rest of your life. Mara gave no answer. That night, she reopened Silas's ledger. The final isolated group was still missing from the earlier pages. She followed the entries minute by minute. A report came from a crew clearing a blocked section, another from someone at the settlement. Then, near dusk, Silas recorded a transmission routed through 2 maintenance points because the normal line remained dead. Contact established with North Group, Mara continued. 3 accounted for, shelter confirmed, supply route advised. The people Ruth's father had worked among had been reached because information moved from one person to another until it reached the control room, then moved outward again. Mara sat beside the stove for a long time. The next morning Ruth arrived, carrying another document she had found among her father's papers. It was an official railroad order, yellowed and creased, bear the name of Superintendent Walter Creed. Mara read the type lines once, then again. The order concerned the underground emergency facility beneath the Crow Glass signal cabin. At the bottom, beneath Creed's signature, was a final instruction after abandonment of the branch. The room was to be permanently sealed. Mara read Walter Creed's order at the cabin table while Ruth stood beside the stove warming her hands. The document was plain enough to feel more disturbing than anything dramatic could have been. It identified the underground emergency control facility by location, listed the abandoned branch, and instructed maintenance personnel to secure the equipment before permanently sealing the access. Creed's signature said at the bottom in dark slanted ink. So he buried it, Mara said. He ordered it sealed, Ruth corrected. That's what I said. No, you said buried, like you already know why. Mara looked at her. Silas stays here during the storm, keeps the communication chain working, disappears from the history book, and later his control room gets sealed by a superintendent. That doesn't bother you? Of course it bothers me. It doesn't give us permission to invent the missing parts. Mara hated that Ruth was right. She read the order again. There was nothing about Silas. Nothing about destroying records. Nothing even suggesting secrecy. The language concerned liability, equipment abandonment, unauthorized access, and closure of facilities no longer required for operations. It sounds like paperwork, Mara admitted. Most history does while it's happening. Ruth opened the folder she had brought. I found more. The additional documents were less complete. A maintenance inventory showed equipment judged too expensive to remove. Another report noted water intrusion risk and deterioration expected after regular crews left the branch. The underground room had required ventilation, maintenance, and access inspections while active. Once the railroad abandoned the line, leaving it open beneath an unattended cabin created a hazard. Someone could fall down those stairs, Ruth said. Mara glanced toward the hatch. I almost did without knowing they existed. Exactly. Then why not fill the room in cost, probably, or effort, seal the entrance, close the building, walk away? That explanation was frustrating because it was ordinary. Mara had expected the signature to answer something. Instead, it made Walter Creed less mysterious. He had been a superintendent closing an obsolete facility on a dying branch. She descended with Ruth into the control room and photographed the order beside the equipment it referenced. They worked through another shelf of records, careful not to disturb more than necessary. Dust covered everything evenly. Several binders contained routine inspections. One held equipment retirement lists. Near the back, Ruth found a folded sheet attached to the closure inventory with a rusted paperclip. Mara. She passed it over. The note carried Creed's name again, this time as an internal instruction. Mara read slowly. Operating logs and emergency records were not to be discarded with obsolete paperwork. They were to remain boxed in the lower facility before closure. Mara looked toward the shelf where she had found Silas's ledger. He told them to leave the records here. Looks that way. Why, Ruth shrugged. Maybe he thought they mattered. Maybe disposal procedures were complicated. Maybe he knew nobody would preserve them otherwise. We can't give him motives the paper doesn't. But it didn't destroy them. No. Mara looked around the room differently. Creed had ordered the control room sealed, but he had also ensured that the records inside survived the closure. Whatever else he had thought about Silas Bell, the evidence did not support the simple story Mara had begun constructing. There was no villain hiding behind the signature. There was an abandoned railroad, an expensive, obsolete room, and paperwork deciding what remained when everyone left. Back upstairs. Ruth opened the railroad history book to the winter of 1952. Look at how this was written, she said. The account summarized days of work in a few paragraphs. Supervisors were named because their reports became official records. Crews became phrases, maintenance personnel, signal staff, local employees. Silas wasn't erased from every record, Mara said. His name is downstairs. Exactly, Ruth tapped the book. This author probably never saw those logs. So he disappeared because nobody looked in the right place. Partly, low-ranking workers disappear easily, especially when the records closest to their work end up sealed under a cabin nobody uses. Mara thought about how quickly a life could become invisible when nobody carried its details forward. She knew that feeling too well. At 19, she had already learned how easily a person could move through a town without being counted. Sleep in a car, wash in a public restroom, work 4 hours stocking shelves, smile when someone asked where you lived. Nothing needed to be deliberately hidden. Sometimes people disappeared simply because no official page had room for what happened to them. Ruth closed the book. Forgotten isn't the same as erased. Mara nodded. But the result can look the same until somebody finds the record. Before leaving, Ruth helped Mara move Silas's ledger away from the underground room's colder exterior wall and into a dry, protected place upstairs. Mara promised not to treat the papers like souvenirs. Whatever they became later, they were evidence first. Outside, the sky had darkened since morning. Eli arrived shortly after Ruth left, walking faster than usual along the grade. Forecast changed, he said. Mara had heard that phrase from him before, but his expression made this time different. How bad, Major Winter Storm? Wind with it? Wind starts building tonight? Worst of it tomorrow. Mara immediately began counting. Food was adequate, water containers could be filled before conditions deteriorated. Dry firewood was the concern. She had enough if consumption stayed normal, but strong wind and lower temperatures could increase how much heat she needed. I can bring more wood in. Do it now, and don't exhaust yourself. Eli checked the temporary weatherproofing around the windows. Anything loose outside needs securing. Once the wind comes up, you stay inside unless there's a real reason not to. Mara nodded. I know. I mean it. I know, Eli. He studied her, perhaps remembering their argument. Your car down by the forest road. Good. Keep it there. They worked separately rather than turning preparation into rescue. Mara filled water containers, brought dry wood inside, checked food, moved bedding farther from drafts, and made sure the stove area remained clear. Eli helped secure one exterior panel she could not safely manage alone, then left before conditions worsened. If you get communication, check in, he said. Mara almost answered that she would be fine. Instead, she said, I will. Snow began after dark. At first it fell quietly. Mara sat near the stove reading Silas's entries while wind strengthened against the walls. She kept returning to Creed's instruction. The room had not been sealed to hide a terrible secret. It had been sealed because its purpose ended. Silas had not vanished because someone carefully removed him. He had vanished because history had compressed hundreds of ordinary workers into a few convenient sentences. Yet his handwriting remained beneath her floor. Forgotten, but not destroyed, around midnight. Wind struck the cabin hard enough to make the cracked window tremble. Mara checked the stove, then the door. The weatherproofing held. An hour later, another gust hit from the north. Something scraped across the roof. She sat upright. A second impact followed, then a rapid fluttering sound outside. Mara raised her flashlight toward the ceiling. A thin line of cold air moved across her face. She found the source near the roof edge where an earlier temporary patch met old boards. The patch had shifted. Powdery snow began blowing through a narrow opening and scattering across the floor. Mara moved her bedding immediately and placed a container beneath the worst spot. The next gust widened the gap. Snow sprayed inside. She stared upward as the wind hammered the cabin again. Her preparations had assumed the building would remain closed. Now, with the storm still strengthening, part of the roof was beginning to fail. Mara's first instinct was to fix the roof immediately. She pulled on her coat, gloves, and boots, while snow continued spraying through the widening gap. Then stopped with her hand on the door latch. The wind struck the cabin hard enough to shake it. She could hear branches moving violently beyond the walls. Going outside meant darkness, blowing snow, an icy roof, and no one close enough to help if she fell. Still, every gust pushed more snow inside. Mara opened the door. Wind ripped it from her hand and drove snow across the floor. She fought it closed again, breathing hard. For several seconds she stood there, angry at the weather, as if it had challenged her personally. Then she remembered Eli telling her that cold made people hurry. She looked at the roof. The damage needed controlling, not conquering. Mara moved everything important away from the leak. She protected her bedding with plastic she had bought for repairs, placed containers beneath melting snow, and shifted her sleeping area toward the stove. Silas's ledger and the other records went into the driest protected corner. She checked the stove draft and added only enough wood to maintain steady heat. Burning through her reserve because she was frightened would create a worse problem later. The temperature inside dropped, but slowly. By 2 a.m, the wind had strengthened. Mara filled another container with snow that had blown inside and dumped it away from her bedding. The absurdity almost made her laugh. She had spent days hauling water uphill, and now frozen water was entering without permission. Her phone showed almost no signal. She typed a message to Eli anyway. Roof patch damaged. I'm inside. Not going out. Supplies okay for now? The message failed. Mara tried again from near the window. Nothing. Her old instinct told her that was fine. She had handled worse. Nobody needed to know. Then she looked at Silas's ledger where she had placed it above the floor. Need fuel. Need confirmation. Need another line. Silas had written requests as if needing another person were no more shameful than needing dry wood. Mara raised the phone higher near the least sheltered corner. One bar appeared and vanished. She sent the message again. This time the screen showed delivered. Eli's reply arrived 12 minutes later. Stay inside. Do not attempt roof. Conserve heat. Check stove ventilation regularly. Will contact when possible. Mara read it twice. She had asked for help, but nothing magical happened. Eli did not appear through the storm. The roof did not repair itself. She was still alone inside the cabin and responsible for surviving the night. Somehow that felt different now. She followed the practical steps. She kept wet material away from dry bedding. She checked the chimney area for signs that snow or damage had affected the stove. She ate a small amount because her body needed energy. She drank treated water instead of rationing herself into dehydration. When the wind briefly weakened, she inspected the leak from inside but did not climb or reach into unstable sections. Near dawn, the storm became worse. Snow pressed against the lower part of the door. The gap near the roof widened another inch, and icy powder swept farther into the room. Mara stared at it, calculating. A quick outside repair might save fuel. 10 minutes with the right material, maybe less. She dressed for it and opened the door only far enough to assess conditions. Visibility ended within yards. Wind-driven snow struck her face like sand. She stepped onto the porch and immediately felt a boot slide. The roof edge above her was crusted with ice. A broken branch flew through the darkness and vanished across the grade. Mara's heart accelerated. She could still try. She could find a ladder position, climb, secure the patch, prove that she did not need to sit inside waiting for somebody else's weather report. Her hand tightened around the door frame. Then she went back inside. She shut the door and locked it. No, she said aloud. The word felt strange. Not defeat, decision. The cabin could take damage. A roof could be repaired. Her body was not another piece of equipment she could replace after making a stupid choice. She removed the outer layer dusted with snow and returned to the stove. Several hours later, another message arrived from Eli. Road blocked. Conditions unsafe. Nobody coming up until wind drops. You okay? Mara answered. Yes. Leak controlled from inside. Staying put. His response was short. Good. That single word gave her more comfort than she wanted to admit. The storm continued through the morning. Mara rationed wood without letting the fire fall dangerously low. She kept the driest pieces for later and burned the less efficient pieces while she had a margin. When she became restless, she read Silas's final storm entries. His circumstances had been far worse, but the pattern felt familiar now. He had never written that rescue was coming. He had written who could still communicate, which routes were blocked, which crews had supplies, and what could safely happen next. At one point, after losing direct contact with an isolated group, he had written, "Hold position. Await confirmed route." Mara smiled faintly. You too? The control room's importance had not been that Silas possessed some extraordinary power. It had been that the room allowed one person's knowledge to reach another person who could use it. Track crews still had to clear snow. Someone still had to carry fuel. Families still had to ration supplies. Silas had kept those separate efforts connected. By afternoon, the wind weakened enough for Mara to hear individual sounds again, rather than one continuous roar. The cabin was colder than normal. One section of floor was wet despite her containers, but the bedding remained dry. The stove still drew properly. The records were safe. She was exhausted, hungry, and alive. Eli reached her only after conditions improved enough for safe travel. He arrived on foot, with snow clinging to his jacket. Mara opened the door before he knocked. His eyes moved over her face, then toward the damaged roof. You okay, Cold? Tired? Anything else? No. He stepped inside and inspected the leak from below. You went outside, Mara hesitated. For about 30 seconds. Eli looked at her and came back in. Why? She almost gave him a sarcastic answer. Instead, she said, because it wasn't safe. He nodded once. Good decision. It didn't feel good. Most good decisions in storms don't. They did not attempt a permanent roof repair. Conditions were still too unstable. They secured what could safely be managed from inside and assessed the damage. Mara expected Eli to take over. He did not. He asked what she had done, checked her reasoning, and pointed out 2 places she needed to watch as temperatures changed. When he offered to carry in additional dry wood from a protected stack, Mara said yes, without explaining herself. That surprised her more than it surprised him. The next morning, the pass emerged under heavy snow and a hard blue sky. Mara stepped outside only after checking conditions. The cabin looked battered. Part of the temporary roof protection had torn away. Snow banked against one wall, but the structure remained standing. Inside, Silas's records remained dry. Her food was low but sufficient. A firewood reserve had survived because she had rationed instead of panicking. Mara stood beside the old grate and looked toward the buried forest. She had bought the cabin because she wanted something nobody could take from her, a place where survival depended only on herself. The storm had shown her the flaw in that bargain. Keeping the cabin was going to require proper roof work, safer access planning, money, knowledge, and help she could not manufacture through stubbornness. $50 had made the property hers. It had not made her capable of everything the property demanded. Behind her, the cabin door stood open, revealing the floor hatch above the forgotten control room. Mara looked at the damaged roof, then at the old railroad grade disappearing beneath snow. For the first time since signing the county papers, the question was no longer whether she could survive here for another night. It was whether she could build a life here without turning survival into another way of being alone. 2 days after the storm, Ruth returned to the cabin carrying a folder thick enough to make Mara clear the table before she set it down. Outside, snow still buried the abandoned grade, but the sky had remained clear long enough for safe travel. The damaged roof was temporarily protected from inside, and below the worst opening, Mara had resisted doing anything permanent until conditions improved. That decision still felt unnatural. But less like weakness than it had during the storm, Ruth removed several copied railroad records. "I think we can finally stop guessing about 1952, Mara sat opposite her. Ruth arranged Silas Bell's emergency log beside reports from maintenance crews and surviving administrative summaries. Seen separately, they had created different versions of the same winter. Together, they became something simpler. No single person had saved Crowglass. Track crews had cleared sections whenever conditions allowed. Workers had carried messages when telephone lines failed. Families in the settlement had consolidated into fewer heated buildings and rationed fuel. Operators farther down the branch had relayed reports. Walter Creed had authorized emergency movements and redirected resources, and beneath Mara's cabin, Silas had kept receiving scattered information and sending it where it could still be useful. "Here," Ruth said, placing 2 pages together. One was Silas's entry about the isolated North Maintenance Group. The other was a crew report written later. Silas had received their broken transmission through an intermediate maintenance point. He had then relayed their location and fuel situation down the line. Another crew used that information when planning a supply movement after part of the track became passable. "My father was with that group," Ruth said. Mara looked at her. Ruth had said it before, but now the documents connected the entire chain. So Silas found him. "Not exactly." Ruth touched the report. "That's the point. Another man heard them first. Someone else kept a relay working. Silas received the information. A crew cleared the route. Other people moved supplies." She paused. "But without somebody keeping those pieces connected, knowing one thing in one place wouldn't have helped anyone somewhere else." Mara looked toward the floor hatch. The secret control room had seemed extraordinary when she first entered it. Now its purpose felt almost ordinary. That made it more important, not less. It had been built to connect things. Ruth turned to the final group of documents. There was no hidden confession, no dramatic explanation for Silas's absence from later histories. His name remained in operating records because that was where low-ranking workers appeared. Later summaries credited departments, supervisors, and management decisions because those were the reports writers could easily find. Walter Creed had ordered the obsolete underground room sealed when the branch closed, but he had also ordered the emergency logs preserved inside it. Silas wasn't erased, Mara said. He was reduced, Ruth nodded, along with a lot of people. She looked at her father's name on the page, until somebody bothered to put the pieces back together. They spent another hour matching entries when Ruth finally packed the documents away. She left copies of the relevant pages with Mara. You found the room, she said. But this belongs to more people than you, months earlier. Mara might have heard that as a threat to something she owned. Now she understood. I know. After Ruth left, Mara sat beside the stove with her phone in her hand. She had been avoiding another kind of unfinished record. Ben Vance's number was still saved. Her uncle had called after she lost her rented room. When Mara had admitted only that money was tight, he had offered his spare room temporarily. She had refused so quickly that the conversation became an argument. Ben had said she was acting like accepting a bed meant signing away her life. Mara had told him he sounded exactly like everyone who thought she could not handle herself. Neither had called afterward. She pressed his name before she could reconsider, then answered on the fourth ring. Mara, hi. Silence. Are you okay? Of course that was his first question. She almost became defensive. Yes. Where are you? Crowglass Pass. Another silence. Why, I bought a cabin. You what? It cost $50. That sentence somehow made this worse. Mara laughed despite herself. Ben did not. Were you living in your car? He asked. She stared at the stove. For a while? Mara, I'm not calling so you can lecture me. I'm trying very hard not to. Try harder. He exhaled. Okay. The old rhythm between them was still there, sharp enough to hurt. Mara rubbed her thumb along the edge of the phone. When you offered me your spare room, I should have answered differently. Ben said nothing. I thought if I came, then I'd owe you, or you'd decide how long I could stay, or I'd get comfortable, and then eventually I'd have to leave anyway. I wasn't trying to control you. I know that now. Did you think I was? I thought needing anybody meant they got to vote in whether I was safe. Her voice became quieter. Mom and I moved so many times. Every place belonged to somebody else. Every favor had an ending. Ben was silent long enough that Mara checked the phone. I couldn't fix what happened with your mom, he finally said. And I probably pushed too hard afterward. I pushed too. You're allowed to ask me for something, Mara. The words made her uncomfortable. She let them. I know. Are you asking now? She looked around the cabin, patched windows, stacked wood, the old stove, storm damage, still waiting for proper repair. Not for a place to live, okay? Maybe for help figuring out some repairs. Not doing everything, just figuring out what I shouldn't do myself. Ben gave a small laugh. That I can probably manage. And I decide what happens here. It's your cabin. You're not allowed to call it a $50 death trap. Can I think it? Probably. This time they both laughed. After the call ended, Mara descended into the control room. She stood before the silent routing board and imagined the winter of 1952 not as one man fighting a mountain, but as dozens of ordinary people doing separate, necessary things. Silas Bell had mattered because he kept those things connected. Mara had bought the cabin because she wanted 4 walls that were hers, a place where nobody could make her leave. She still wanted that. But ownership alone had nearly become another kind of trap. If she used it to prove she needed nobody, she climbed upstairs and stepped outside. The roof still required permanent work. Access remained difficult. Money remained tight. Winter was nowhere near finished. Keeping this place would demand more than determination. Mara looked at the battered cabin and understood the choice waiting for her. It could remain the place where she had survived because she had nowhere else to go. Or she could begin the harder work of making it a home she could actually sustain. Mara's first decision after the storm was not to repair anything. It was to find out what repairing the cabin properly would require. That distinction cost her 3 days of phone calls, photographs, measurements, and conversations with people who kept asking why a 19-year-old owned an abandoned railroad signal cabin in Crowglass Pass. She stopped explaining after the third call. A roofer in Black Pine studied her photographs and told her the damaged section could be stabilized for winter, but a permanent repair should wait for safer conditions. A county clerk confirmed that owning the parcel did not give Mara permission to improve the old forest access beyond its existing legal limits. Owen Pike reminded her that the sale had included no guarantee of utilities or year-round vehicle access. "I remember," Mara said. "You warned me approximately 14 times. I wanted the paperwork to survive your optimism. My optimism has mostly frozen to death." "Good. Reality lasts longer." Mara wrote everything down. Some repairs require professionals. Some could wait until spring. Others, she could handle herself if she learned first instead of experimenting. The list was longer than her money. Roof stabilization, window replacement, floor inspection, better insulation, chimney maintenance, exterior drainage. None of it turned the cabin into a charming mountain home overnight. It simply gave Mara a sequence. She could live with a sequence. Ben arrived on a clear Saturday carrying tools, work gloves, and enough food to reveal that he still did not trust her definition of groceries. Mara met him near the forest road and immediately pointed at his truck bed. "I said help with repairs. Those are sandwiches. There are 12. Repair work creates hunger." She tried not to smile. The walk to the cabin was awkward at first. Ben asked about the trail. Mara answered. He asked about her temporary work. She answered. Neither mentioned the months when she had avoided calling him. When they reached the cabin, Ben stood outside, looking at the weathered structure. "You're not allowed to say it." "I haven't said anything." "Your face did." He raised both hands. "Your cabin." Inside, Mara showed him the storm damage and the list of repairs. She expected him to start issuing instructions. Instead, he read the list and asked, "What do you want me to help with?" The question mattered more than she wanted it to. "The window frame? And I want another opinion on the floor before I spend money." "Okay." "Not the roof?" "Why?" "Professional." Ben nodded. "Good." They worked for several hours without turning the visit into a rescue operation. Ben held materials while Mara measured. Mara made mistakes and corrected them. When he suggested a different way to seal one draft, she asked why, listened, then decided to use it. Accepting his knowledge did not make the cabin less hers. By afternoon, the room held heat better than it had that morning. Ben sat near the stove, eating one of his excessive sandwiches. His eyes moved toward the open floor hatch. "So that's the famous secret room, famous to about 4 people. Mara took him downstairs. Ben examined the control boards, telephone hardware, maps, and shelves without touching them. "All this was under you, apparently, and you bought it for $50. "There it is. What the $50 part?" "I'm still processing it." Ruth arrived the following week with archival sleeves, copied documents, and a plan for organizing what they had found. Mara had already stopped moving original records unnecessarily. Together they numbered photographs, matched Silas Bell's ledger entries to surviving railroad reports, and separated original documents from copies used for research. Nothing left the cabin casually. Ruth contacted local historical resources about proper preservation rather than treating the room as a collection of objects Mara could distribute. People are going to want to see this, Mara said. Eventually. Perhaps. Ruth placed Silas's ledger into protective storage. Preservation first. Attention second. You really know how to ruin excitement. That is why old things survive me. The control room slowly became less mysterious and more meaningful. Labels were documented, maps were photographed. Silas's name was connected to other workers instead of elevated above them. Mara liked that. The truth was better than the legend she might have invented. Eli continued stopping by when his work brought him near Crowglass Pass. Though he no longer inspected every decision as if expecting Mara to injure herself. One afternoon he found her replacing a damaged interior board. That looks almost competent. Almost. I'm protecting your humility. You could protect it from farther away. He smiled and handed her the screws she had left beyond reach. Their relationship had settled into something Mara did not need to name. He helped when she asked. She did the same when she could. Sometimes they drank coffee beside the stove and talked about ordinary things instead of storms, railroads, or survival. The ordinariness felt surprisingly intimate. Money remained the least romantic part of owning the cabin. Mara continued motel cleaning and stocking shifts, saving small amounts after food, gasoline, and repair expenses. She reopened the information she had once collected about EMT training. The application deadline had not passed. Tuition and transportation were still problems, but for the first time, she treated those problems as questions requiring plans rather than reasons to quit. She called the program. She asked about schedules, prerequisites, and payment options. Then she wrote the answers beside her cabin repair list. One evening, Ben called and offered to pay for part of a repair. Mara's first reaction was immediate resistance. I can't take that. Why? Because it's mine. I'm aware. She stood silently beside the stove. What if I lend you parts of it, he asked, with terms. If you want terms, Mara did. They agreed on an amount she could repay slowly, without sacrificing food or heat. When the call ended, she noticed that accepting help with boundaries felt entirely different from surrendering control. Weeks later, Owen Pike came up with a county employee to verify an old parcel marker. He stood outside the cabin, staring at the repaired window and stabilized roof section, still standing, he said. So am I. You get all this for $50? Mara looked at the cabin. She thought of the first freezing night, treated creek water, stove inspection, firewood, temporary jobs, the storm, Ben's tools, Eli's warnings, Ruth's records, and the long list of repairs still waiting. Beneath the floor, Silas Bell's handwriting survived because someone decades earlier had decided it should remain. $50 had bought none of what came afterward. It had only opened the door. Mara smiled slightly. No, she said, $50 just got me the key. Spring reached Crowglass Pass slowly. Snow remained in the deepest shadows long after the lower roads around Black Pine turned muddy, and every morning still began with Mara checking the temperature before deciding how much wood the stove needed. The cabin had not transformed into the kind of mountain home people photographed for magazines. Its siding was weathered. One window still needed replacing. The floor remained uneven in places, and permanent exterior work waited for warmer, drier weeks. But the roof no longer admitted snow. The stove was maintained, the drafts were controlled, and Mara had routines for water, food, fuel, and weather. For the first time in years, everything she owned was not packed for a quick departure. Her clothes had a place. Her mother's photographs had a shelf. Her work boots dried beside the stove. A folder on the table held information for EMT training, including the steps Mara had already completed and the expenses she still needed to manage.
She continued cleaning motel rooms and taking stocking shifts when available. Money remained tight enough that she counted grocery costs before reaching the register.
The difference was that she was planning forward instead of measuring how many nights remained before everything ran out. On a clear April morning, Ruth arrived with 2 people helping document the Crow Glass Railroad history. There was no ceremony, no crowd, and no plan to turn Mara's cabin into an attraction. That was intentional. The control room was too fragile, the access too difficult, and the records too important to expose casually. Instead, they photographed equipment, recorded dimensions, copied labels, and cataloged documents so the history could exist somewhere beyond the room itself. Mara stood near the staircase while Ruth placed a copied page beside a photograph of her father. He hated having his picture taken. Ruth said, "Looks like it." He thought smiling made him look foolish.
Did it?
Ruth studied the photograph. "Absolutely." Mara laughed. Ruth added her father's crew information beside Silas Bell's emergency records. He would not be remembered merely as one of 3 isolated workers anymore. His name would sit within the larger account alongside the crews who cleared track, the operators who relayed messages, the families who rationed fuel, and the workers who carried supplies. Silas's name would be there too, but not as a mythical hero who had single-handedly saved Crowglass. The evidence did not support that story, and Mara no longer wanted it to. Walter Creed's documents were included as well. The superintendent, who at first seemed like the obvious man to blame for burying the truth, turned out to deserve neither condemnation nor sainthood. He had authorized emergency operations during the winter of 1952. Years later, when the branch became obsolete, he ordered the underground facility sealed because it had become a liability. Yet he also instructed that its emergency logs remain inside instead of being discarded. Whether he understood how important those records would become decades later, nobody could prove. Ruth insisted that uncertainty remain part of the account. "History gets damaged when people make dead people convenient," she said. "Villains are convenient, heroes too." Mara looked at Silas's ledger. Ordinary people are harder, usually more accurate. The forgotten settlement also returned to the map, at least historically, not as a lost city and not as some grand vanished community, but as what it had actually been. A small railroad settlement along Crowglass Pass where maintenance workers and their families once lived beside the line. The foundation stones Mara had found, the railroad maps, Ruth's records, and surviving documents established its location. A local historical map would mark Crowglass settlement again, with dates and context explaining why almost nothing remained. The forest had not concealed a fantasy. It had simply reclaimed buildings after people left. Mara preferred that truth too. Eli arrived late that afternoon after work and waited until the documentation was finished before descending into the control room. "You realize," he said, "this place looked less organized when nobody knew it existed." "That's generally how organizing works." "I liked it better when you were impressed by my mountain knowledge." "I was never impressed." "You asked me questions." That was desperation. He smiled. Their relationship had changed without either of them announcing it. He no longer appeared because he thought Mara needed monitoring. Sometimes he came because she invited him. Sometimes she walked down to meet him. Once, when he needed an extra pair of hands moving equipment for a volunteer training exercise, Mara helped him. Assistants had begun traveling in both directions, which made it easier for her to understand what Silas's logs had been saying all along. Connection was not a deck ledger. One person could need help today and provide it tomorrow. Ben understood her boundaries better too. He called before visiting. Mara repaid part of what she had borrowed even when he told her not to rush. When she needed advice about a repair, she asked directly instead of spending 2 days pretending she already knew the answer. None of those changes made her less capable. If anything, she had become more capable because she was no longer wasting energy proving it. Near evening, after everyone else had gone upstairs, Mara remained alone in the control room. Ruth had left Silas's ledger available while they completed one final set of photographs. Mara opened it carefully to the last completed emergency entry from the winter of 1952. She had expected something meaningful the first time she searched for the ending, some final statement from Silas about why he stayed after being ordered to abandon the post. There was nothing like that. The last completed entry was practical. A time, a relay point, confirmation that the final isolated crew had made contact. That was all. No declaration of courage, no claim that he had saved anyone, just confirmation that people who had been unreachable were unreachable no longer. Mara closed the ledger and rested her hands on the edge of the old desk around her. The mechanical switches remained silent. The telephone would never ring again. The routing board would never direct another train. Yet the room had finally completed one more connection. Silas's record had reached Ruth. Ruth's father had become more than a forgotten crew designation. Crowglass Settlement had returned to a map. And Mara, who had bought the cabin because she wanted somewhere nobody could make her leave, had discovered that staying somewhere was different from shutting everyone else out. She climbed the stairs and closed the hatch carefully behind her. The next morning was cold enough for frost. Mara woke early, lit the stove, checked the weather, and measured the remaining firewood. She made coffee, calculated what she could spend on groceries that week, and added a reminder about an EMT training requirement to her calendar. There was no sudden wealth waiting beneath the floor. No treasure had solved her poverty. The cabin still demanded repairs, her work remained inconsistent, and one unexpected expense could still hurt. But difficulty no longer automatically meant disaster. When she needed help, she asked before desperation made the choice for her. When somebody needed something she could reasonably give, she helped without imagining that kindness created ownership. After breakfast, Mara stepped outside with her coffee. Morning light reached between the pines and touched the abandoned railroad grade. Snowmelt ran through old drainage channels. Farther north, beyond nearly 3 miles of forest, foundation stones marked where Crowglass Settlement had once stood. Mara remembered her first walk to the cabin, when every mile from the maintained road had felt like another layer separating her from the world. Back then, isolation had looked like safety. If nobody could reach her, nobody could disappoint her, control her, or take away the place where she slept. Now she looked at the old railroad grade and saw something else. It had once carried workers, families, supplies, messages, and people trying to reach one another through terrible weather. Even abandoned, its purpose was visible. A line existed because one place connected to another. Mara turned toward the cabin. $50 had bought weathered boards, broken glass, an old stove, a difficult parcel, and a hidden room nobody remembered. Everything that made it a home had come afterward: work, caution, knowledge, mistakes, trust, and people willing to carry something when she could not carry all of it herself. Beneath her floor, Silas Bell's forgotten control room remained proof that surviving alone had never been the lesson.